Non-local group policy objects. Now before we actually get stuck into configuring any policies, let's take a look at how policies are actually applied, because understanding this information can be key to successfully deploying group policy. Now the first policy to be applied at a computer that is a member of an Active Directory domain is the local GPO policy. Every Windows 2003 computer has exactly one local GPO stored on the local computer. The next policy to be applied are GPOs that have been linked to a site that the computer is a member of. Now GPOs are applied synchronously, and an administrator can specify the order in which site policies can be applied. Next, domain policies are applied. Like with site policies, domain policies are applied synchronously, and administrators can also specify the order in which they're applied. Finally, policies specified at the organizational unit or OU are then applied. If there are OUs inside other OUs, then the policy linked to the OU at the top of the hierarchy is applied first, with all child OU policies being applied in order. If multiple GPOs are linked to an OU, then they're also applied synchronously until all policies have been applied. Now this policy processing order from local to OU also means that policies that conflict are overwritten by the next policy in line. So when a site policy is applied, if an identical local policy has already been applied and the site policy has conflicting settings, the site policy will win and override the local policy settings. Similarly, when a domain policy is applied and it has settings that conflict with site policies, the domain policy will be the applied policy. And finally, policies at the OU level will of course override the domain policies. So in other words, if we configured a policy at the domain level that allowed a user to perform a certain function, but our policy at the OU level denied the user the ability to perform the same function, then the user would be denied permission to perform the task as the OU policy would win. Finally, when policies are applied, if a conflict exists between a computer setting and a user configuration setting, then the user configuration setting will win and be applied as user policies are more specific. Okay, so enough talking about it. Let's go and have a look at configuring group policy in an Active Directory domain. So the first thing we need to do is to decide whether the policy we're going to create is going to be linked to a site, a domain, or an OU. If you want to create a policy at the site level, we'll do this from Active Directory Sites and Services. So we'll expand our sites, and we have a site here called US. So we'll right click on the US site, we'll select Properties, and then we'll select the Group Policy tab. Now by default, we don't have any policies defined at the site level. So to create a new policy, we'd simply click on New. Now this creates a new policy in the Group Policy Object Links window, and now we need to supply our policy with a name. So we'll just call this one Site to make it easy to identify. Now I should point out at this stage that when you have a lot of policies defined that configure specific settings, make sure you do name them appropriately to make figuring out what they do a lot easier in the future. Okay, so now we have a policy. Now we have 6 buttons down here to choose from. The New button will allow us to create another policy, and we've just seen that here. The Add button allows us to link this policy to another policy that we may have already created. The Edit button allows us to edit the policy that we've selected in the window up here. The Options button is where we can configure the No Override and Disabled items, which we will see in these columns here, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Delete kind of speaks for itself and lets us delete a policy. And finally we have Properties, which lets us configure some additional settings for this policy. So let's take a look at these now. Okay, what we'll do is we'll click on Add, and we can see here links to other policies that we might have created elsewhere in our organization. Now by default, when we created our site policy a moment ago, it will only apply to the site called US where we created it. But some other administrator in our organization might have created another policy and say linked it to an OU, and we think it's a really great policy. Well, rather than having to recreate all of the work this administrator's done, we could simply click on the policy and then click OK. And now we see his policy is linked to our site. Now we can now highlight the policy that we've just added and click on Delete. Now this gives us 2 options. The first option is to just remove the link. The second option deletes the link and also deletes the physical policy. Now I know if I choose the second option and delete the policy, my good friend and fellow administrator that created it won't be such a good friend anymore, so I'll select the first option and just delete the link. That way, the policy will still be applied at the OU where he created it. So when you really need to delete a GPO, do select the second option, and make sure that's truly what you want to do before clicking OK. So I'll just delete the link and select OK, and the policy disappears from my site. Now let's click on Options, and we have two to choose from. The first option is No Override. Now checking this box specifies that other GPOs that may be applied to our site should not override this policy. Now in English, this means that we want this policy to be enforced no matter what anyone else says. The next option is to disable a policy, so checking this box disables the policy from being applied to our site, but it doesn't delete it. Next, let's go and take a look at the properties of our GPO, and here we have 4 tabs: General, Links, Security, and WMI Filter. On the default tab, the General tab, we can see some information about when our GPO was created, when it was last modified, and the number of revisions we've made to the policy. Now down the bottom here, we also have the option to disable the computer configuration settings or the user configuration settings. So why would I want to do this? Well, if we're configuring a policy where we only want settings that apply to a computer, for example, we can then disable the user configuration settings to improve performance. It makes applying the policy faster because in this example, half of the processing would be skipped completely. So if you're in the habit of splitting policies based on user or computer configurations only, then be sure to use these options because they are your friends. Now on the Links tab, we can click on the Find Now button and it will search Active Directory to see if any sites, domains or OUs are currently linked to this policy and are using it. So before we go ahead and actually delete a policy, it's a good idea to come over to this tab, run a quick check, just in case the administrator around the corner has come in and borrowed our policy. So just to be sure we don't start getting any nasty phone calls. Now on the Security tab, we can set the permissions who can actually apply our policy. Now by default, the Authenticated Users group has both the Read and Apply group policy settings. Now at the very least, if you want a policy to take effect, a user needs to have both Read and Apply group policy permissions. Now if you want the policy to be applied to specific users or groups, a word of warning here, do not set the Authenticated Users group's permission to Deny, because everyone, including an administrator, is an authenticated user. And if you set this to Deny, the result is that nobody will be able to apply this policy. Instead, what you do is clear the Allow Policy checkbox for the Authenticated Users group and then add the required group into the Access Control list by clicking on Add, and then locating the user or group in Active Directory, and then selecting the Read and Apply Group Policy option. Alternatively, you could select all of the groups that this policy won't apply to and then deny these groups access. Remember, deny entries override allow entries. So if a user belongs to 2 groups and one is set to allow and the other is set to deny, then the user will not be able to apply the policy. Now finally we have the WMI Filter tab. Now WMI is a really cool scripting interface that lets you get really specific about which configurations will be applying this policy. So for example, we could write a WMI script that says, if the computer we're running this policy against isn't Windows XP Professional, then we won't apply this policy. Now the default, as you can see, is not to use WMI, but if you want to use WMI, click on this filter here and then the Browse Manage button. Now this brings up a new window where we can manage our WMI filters. Now as you can see, we don't actually have any predefined, but we can certainly fix that. So to add a new WMI filter, we'll click on the Advanced button, which will expand our window to reveal some more options. Now we'll click on New, which allows us to create a new WMI filter in the window below. Now we'll need to give our WMI filter a name. So we'll just call out Windows XP, and we'll also give it a description of computers running Windows XP Professional. Now in the queries field below, this is where we'll actually type our WMI query. So here, I've entered in a query that uses WMI to check a target computer to see if the class of Win32 operating system returns a value of Microsoft Windows XP Professional. If it responds with some other version of Windows is installed, then the policy will not be applied. Now we can save our query by clicking on the Save button, and then we'll click OK. Now we can see that our Windows XP WMI filter is displayed in our filter window and will now be applied to our policy. Now the last button we have here is the Edit button. So we'll click on Edit, and this is the meat and potatoes as far as our group policies go. This opens up the Group Policy Object Editor, and this is where we actually configure the options that our users and computers will get. Okay, firstly at the top here, on the left hand side of our Group Policy Object Editor, we can see the object that we're editing, which is our site policy. Underneath the policy name, we have the computer configuration and user configuration sections we spoke about when we discussed local policies earlier. But just to refresh your mind, the computer configuration contains the settings used to set policies that apply to computers, regardless of which users log onto it, and these policies are applied when the operating system first boots up. And of course the user configuration contains the settings used to set policies that apply to users, regardless of which computer the user logs onto. And these policies are applied when the user first logs onto the computer. And of course we can also see that again, both contain an identical set of subfolders. Now just to reiterate, software settings is where we manage our applications, Windows settings lets us manage scripts and security settings, and administrative templates contains our registry-based settings. Now there's literally hundreds of policies we can configure using the Group Policy Object Editor, so it's not possible for us to go through them all. We'll skip software settings for now, as we have a separate video that discusses software in depth. So we'll expand Windows settings under our computer configuration, and we have two options, scripts and security settings. Now keep in mind as we navigate through the computer configuration section that these policies will only apply to computers, and they will only be applied when the computer is rebooted. So we'll select scripts, and in the right hand window we have two options, start up and shut down. Now as obvious as it sounds, we can specify scripts here that run when a computer starts up, and scripts that run when a computer is shut down. So we'll right click on Startup and we'll select Properties, which opens the properties of our startup scripts. Now currently we don't have any scripts defined. So to add one, we could simply click on Add, and then browse to the location where we have the script stored, as well as provide any optional script parameters. The Show Files button will take us to the default location where our script files are stored. Now, regarding this file path up here, you'll note that it defaults to the name of our domain, testdomain.com, then the sysvol folder, and then testdomain.com again. Now followed by policies, and now the unique name of our policy, and I won't bother reading all that out, and then machines, scripts, and startup. Now I wanted to point this out for a reason. The sysvol folder you might be familiar with is included in Active Directory replication. So storing our scripts in this location is a good idea, especially if you have domain controllers dotted around the globe that all need to run the same script. That way, if the script happens to be changed, then all domain controllers that replicate this information will also have the new script automatically. Now the shutdown script here is basically the same as the startup script we just looked at, so we won't bother going through that. So next we'll expand security settings, and as you can see here we have quite a few options. Under account policies, we can configure our password and account lockout policies. Now we won't go through these two here because we've discussed these already in great detail in our videos on creating user accounts. Now local policies allows us to configure things like auditing of objects such as files and folders, as well as things like logons. We can also configure user rights such as whether a user can use terminal services or log on locally, and we have security options where we can restrict users from, say, accessing a CD-ROM or loading unsigned drivers. Under the event log, we can configure how big we'll let the event logs grow, as well as how long we'll keep these logs. Now restricted groups allows us to modify the groups that should be restricted to certain members. So for example, if an administrator goes and adds a couple of users to the administrators group, we can use this policy to reset, if you like, the administrators group so that it only contains the members that it should contain. To configure restricted groups, we can simply select restricted groups, right click and choose Add Group. Then we'll browse for a group, we'll click on Advanced and Find Now, And for argument's sake, we'll accept the administrators group, and then we'll click on OK, OK, and then OK again. Now up here, we can individually add members into our restricted policy by clicking on Add and then locating the member in Active Directory. Now underneath, we can add other groups that our administrators group should be a member of. Now when this policy is applied, only the members that have been configured in this list will remain in the administrators group. Any user or group not appearing in this list will then be removed. Of course, the same applies for the member of option. The administrators group in this example will be made a member of the groups configured in this list and removed from any groups that it shouldn't belong to. So restricted groups, in a nutshell, lets us ensure that if changes are made to our group structure, then group policy will put it back the way it should be. Next, we have system services. This is where we can set the startup state of Windows services. So for example, let's say we don't want our Windows XP users to be able to use themes. What we can do is we can scroll down and we can find themes, and then we'll double click on it and we'll check this box to define this policy setting. Now we can set this service to disabled so it won't start when the user's computer starts. Finally, if we click on Edit Security, we can also define permissions using the Windows Access Control List so users don't have the permission to change any of these settings. Next we have Registry, and here we can set permissions on registry keys. So if we right click and choose Add Key, we can browse for a specific key that we want to protect. When we've located the key, we simply highlight it and click OK. And then at this point, we can again use the Windows Access Control List to control whether users have permissions to modify any of our registry settings. Next, we have the file system. Here we can set which permissions users can have on specified files and folders. So to add a file or folder, we'll right-click and select Add File. Now we can browse for our file or folder. We'll just select the Windows directory for the sake of the example here, and we'll choose OK. And we're again presented with a Windows Access Control List so we can specify which users have permissions to access this directory or file. Now next, we have wireless network policies. Now here we can set up policies that define preferred networks and security options, such as whether we require a smart card for logon or web encryption. Now this policy is discussed in our wireless security video, so we'll skip the details on this one. Next we have public key policies, and this is discussed in detail in our videos on certificates, but as a brief summary, it's where you can set up things like automatic certificate enrollment settings and trusted root certification authorities. Then comes software restriction policies. Now this is where we can restrict a user's ability to run certain applications or scripts. And finally, we have IP security policies. Now we discussed this in detail in our video on IPsec, and this of course is where we can set our IPsec policies. Now under administrative templates, if we expand the subfolders, we can see we literally have heaps of options here, so I won't go through all of these. I'll leave it up to you to spend some time looking through all of them, but we will go and touch on a few during the course of this video. Now under the user configuration, we have many of the same subfolders we saw in the computer configuration, but of course these relate to users, not computers. For example, under Windows settings, we can define log on and log off scripts instead of the startup and shutdown scripts we looked at under the computer configuration. Things that are specific to users are things like folder redirection, where we can take some common file paths such as the user's My Documents folder or the desktop and start menus and redirect them to be stored on a file server rather than the local machine. We can also set Internet Explorer options, such as pre-populating Internet Explorer with a list of favorites, or setting a default homepage, predefining users' proxy settings, setting security options, and setting which applications which are defaults for things like email and newsgroups. Under Administrative Templates, we can set pre-configured options for the built-in Windows components. For example, let's say we're running a Windows software update server and we want to prevent a user from using Windows Update to update their own computer with patches that an administrator has not approved. Well, we can select Windows Update and then come over here and configure the policy to remove access to all of the Windows Update features. Now this will prevent users from updating their own computers. Now of course down here below you can see a whole bunch more folders that relate to things like the desktop and the control panel and so on. Alright, well what we'll do is we'll close this down for now, and this time we'll go to Active Directory Users and Computers and we'll configure a policy there. Now I'll expand my domain and I'll select the Users OU. Now in our Users OU we have a user called Bob who's been created, and I'm going to get Bob to log onto a PC called XP Client. Now what I'll do first is to create two new OUs so we can see the differences in a computer-based policy and a user-based policy. So I'll right click on the domain and I'll select New Organizational Unit, and we'll call this one US Computers and hit enter. Then we'll right click again and we'll select New Organizational Unit and we'll call this one US Users. Now I'd expect that most of you would have your OU structures already defined and they'd probably look nothing like this. Now that's perfectly fine. We're just doing this now to make it easier to identify which ones we're dealing with. So what we'll do is we'll come over here to our Computers OU and we'll drag this into our US Computers OU. And then we'll go to our Users OU and we'll grab Bob's account and we'll drop that one in the US Users OU. Now we'll right click on our US Computers OU and we'll select Properties and then the Group Policy tab. Now we'll select New to create a new policy and we'll give our policy a name and we'll call this one Computer, and then we'll click on Edit. Now under the Computer Configuration setting we'll expand Windows Settings and Security Settings. Then we'll expand Local Policies and we'll select User Rights Assignment. In the right hand pane we'll scroll down and we'll select Shut Down the System. We'll right click and select Properties and then we'll choose to define this policy setting. Then we'll need to add a user or group, so we'll click Add User or Group and then we'll come over here to the Browse button and Advanced and Find Now, and then we'll locate Bob's account and we'll click OK and OK again and then OK one more time. Okay, now our policy has been defined, so we'll click OK and we can close down our Group Policy Object Editor and then we can close down our US Computers properties. Now we'll go and right click on our US Users OU and then we'll select Properties and the Group Policy tab. Again we'll select New to create a new policy and we'll just call this one User, and then we'll click on Edit to bring up the Group Policy Object Editor. Now under the user configuration we'll expand our administrative templates and then we'll click on Start Menu and Taskbar. And then we'll come over here to the right and we'll scroll down and we'll choose to remove the All Programs list from the Start menu. So we'll right click, select Properties. Now currently we can see that this policy is set to Not Configured, so we'll click on Enable and then we'll click OK. And now again we can close down our Group Policy Object Editor as well as our US Users properties, and now our policies have been done. Okay, here we are at Bob's computer, so what I'll do now is I'll enter in Bob's password and we'll hit enter and we'll log Bob onto our domain. Now if you recall what I spoke about earlier about policies, user policies take effect when a user logs on and computer policies take effect when a computer boots up. So what we should expect to see here is that the All Programs link on our Start menu should be removed, but our computer policy restricting Bob from shutting down the computer should not be applied. Okay, we've logged in now, so what we'll do is we'll click on the Start button, and yes, we can see here that the All Programs link that was here has now been removed. So we'll click on Shut Down, and yes, Bob indeed does have the ability to shut down our machine. So what we'll do is we'll shut down his machine, we'll click OK. So what I'll do is pause this video and start up Bob's computer again, and then we'll return once this is complete. Okay, Bob's PC has now been restarted, so what we'll do is we'll Control-Alt-Delete and enter in Bob's password, and we'll log him back onto our domain. And now we'll have to see if his computer policy was applied, so we'll click on Start, and yes, we can see that his user policy is still being applied, so we'll click on Shut Down, and in this drop down box we can see that Bob only has the option now to log off the computer and he can't shut it down. Okay, so now you've seen the power of group policy. So do yourself a favour, spend some time with group policy, and you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish with just a bit of planning. So the next thing we'll do is we'll take a look at the resultant set of policy tool that helps us analyse what happens when we have multiple policies being applied to a user or computer.